Well, it's December now, and as we embark upon this Advent season, it's now time to take a look back at the books I've been reading over the last month. Welcome back to another of my monthly book review videos. Since it is now December, as I mentioned at the beginning, that means it's time for me to review all the books I read in November of 2024. If you're new here, this is a regular feature here on this Phobophile channel. I'm mostly a horror nerd, and this is of course a horror-themed channel, so if you're looking for reviews of horror novels, you've certainly come to the right place. But I'm also something of an eclectic nerd, so you'll find some other non-horror books mixed in as well. That's just the way we do things around here, and regular viewers will tell you there's simply no telling what kinds of literary rabbit holes I might decide to tumble down in any given month. This month, I've certainly got some good ones for you. After a couple of slower months for me, I've finally gotten back to actually reading a half-decent number of books this month. And just to tease you a little bit in advance, some of these really are great. But just to get a little bit of bookkeeping out of the way right from the start, let me just remind you that if you're interested in any of these books for yourself, I've put wonderful and convenient purchase links right down there in the What's It. Using those is a great way to get some books for yourself and to support my own work here on this channel. You'll also find links down there to my other projects and places you can get copies of my own books, which of course I'm not reviewing. And of course, since this is in fact the beginning of the Christmas season, let me just remind you that my books make great gifts, and buying them is a great gift from you to me. While you're doing nice things for me, do make sure that you've subscribed and have rung the notifications bell. Leave me some comments, like the video, share with a friend, family member, hell, share with a passing acquaintance. Anything to help me grow my audience, and my thanks in advance. But we're here not for me to advertise myself, we're here for the books, so let's get right to the reviews. I began this November by reading this Conspiracies and Secret Societies, the complete dossier of hidden plots and schemes by Brad Steger and Sherry Hansen Steger. This is essentially an encyclopedia of conspiracy theories. As such, you can expect to read about almost every conspiracy theory you can think of, and plenty you've probably never even heard of. But you can also expect that in order to fit them all in, the treatment of each one necessarily has to be somewhat superficial. And the book exactly meets expectations in that regard. None of the treatments here, of even the most complicated theories, receives more than a couple pages, and most substantially less even than that, but the breadth of coverage is quite impressive. I'm not going to say this is a complete list of every conspiracy theory in the world. Not only would that require a volume many times the size of this one, but it would also simply be impossible because, especially in the internet age, we seem to be churning out new conspiracy theories faster even than those of us who study such things can keep track of. There are new ones this week. My social media, I was finding new ones this morning. There are tons of conspiracy theories out there, so it would be impossible for this to be complete. But it is, nevertheless, fairly extensive. This is, in fact, a revised third edition of the book, which was published in 2023, this edition was, and as such, it does include entries for some more contemporary theories surrounding things like the 2020 American election, QAnon, Antifa, Jeffrey Epstein, and so forth. That raises an important point we need to make in reviewing this third edition. It was not entirely written by the husband and wife duo whose names appear on the cover. Brad Steger was an author of I don't even know how many books about the paranormal, UFOs, spirituality, and, yes, conspiracy theories. Clearly, he was a devotee of the subject, and his books achieved quite a bit of popularity. But of course, his books were also criticized for leaning perhaps too heavily into the belief in some of the fringe claims. He died, though, in 2018. His wife and co-author of this book, along with several others, Sherry Hansen Steger, had a similar bibliography, but is also sadly deceased, having passed in 2020. In order to present this third edition, the publisher claims to have assembled a team to research and write the new entries. However, the team members are not named, and it's not made clear within the text which entries they wrote and whether or not they revised any of the Stegers' earlier entries. That becomes an important piece of information when reviewing this book, because while I liked the book overall, and I do think it will continue to be a good desk reference whenever I need to look up a quick summary of some conspiracy theory or other, I did notice some inconsistencies with regard to how neutrally some of the conspiracy theories are described. The vast majority of them are presented just for what they are, without either endorsing nor attempting to debunk any of the claims involved with the conspiracy theory. But some of them do present arguments for and against the theory in question, and maybe it's just my own inner conspiracy theorist piping up here, but I occasionally found myself wondering to what degree some kind of editorial bias may have crept in, not necessarily to falsify any information, but perhaps to put a thumb on the scales when determining which entries to present neutrally and which to present with a greater degree of skepticism or critical analysis. Presumably, if you're the sort of person who wants to read an encyclopedia of conspiracy theories, you're probably already the kind of person who wants to do your own research rather than accepting anything. And that includes either the conspiracy theory itself or the so-called official narrative it seeks to replace. Apply the same kind of thinking while reading this book, and you should be in pretty good shape. Fortunately, each entry does contain a short list of sources where you can begin some of that reading whenever you want to follow up on a particular conspiracy theory that you found to be of interest. However, be forewarned that the lists of citations are brief indeed, so they're only a starting point, not anything approaching a complete bibliography on any of these subjects. So, clearly I didn't start off with a horror novel, despite this being a horror channel, but even still, I think there's a fair amount of overlap between the horror genre and conspiracy theory. Many of the conspiracy theories are, in fact, pretty horrific, and a book like this can even be a goldmine for horror authors or screenwriters looking for some interesting new ideas. So this is recommended for people who are interested in, I guess what we would say, horror nonfiction. I then read another one, which is also nonfiction, but perhaps more directly connected to the horror genre, and that's The Anatomy of Evil by Michael H. Stone. I picked this one up hoping for answers to a series of related questions I've been asking for many, many years, pretty much my entire adult life, as long as I can remember. Or perhaps, if not answers to those questions, at least some further explorations of the subject. Those questions are related to, essentially, why people do evil things. And my definition of evil in this context can be fairly broad, but I'm thinking of the kinds of things we'd all agree are evil. Murders, war crimes, tortures, that kind of thing. And this book, written by a psychiatrist with some experience studying such people, promised some deep thinking on the subject, so I was keen to dive right in and get started. A good portion of the book is dedicated to fleshing out the author's 22-tier hierarchy of evil. It's a fairly interesting scale that he's devised, Stage 1 includes justifiable homicide, and then the levels go all the way up to the top, which consists of psychopathic torture murderers. I suspect if any person sat down with hundreds of case files and tried to come up with their own hierarchy of which acts are more or less evil than others, they would probably come up with something a little bit different from this author's, but they'd all probably agree in broad strokes. Killings in self-defense are, if evil at all, less evil than intentional murders. Intentional murders are less evil than torture murders, and so forth. As such, I wouldn't consider this scale to be of particular value diagnostically, but it does give us a sort of mechanism to discuss the gradations of various heinous acts. Much of the book consists of explorations of this scale's different levels, complete with plenty of case studies at each level. Those are quite interesting, though of course each case is presented briefly and fairly superficially, consisting of no more than a couple pages each, just because of the length of the book, and that's all quite fascinating reading. Enjoyment is the wrong word when talking about this subject matter, but I did find it intellectually stimulating to read. However, as I was reading it, what I found somewhat lacking was deep discussion of the etiology of evil. Not that I'm naive enough to think there is only one cause, and to the extent the author does get into this subject, he's careful also to point out that no two of the studies are exactly the same, and evil must be caused by an interaction between numerous factors. All of that's true, but, getting back to my original point there, most of the book's length is dedicated to the development of this hierarchy, rather than what I was really looking for, which was a deep scientific exploration, or philosophical exploration for that matter, although the author's a scientist, as to what causes some people to go so rotten. But, just as I was feeling like I might be disappointed on that topic, the author then delivered a 9th and final chapter dedicated to pretty much exactly what I was looking for. In that chapter, he goes through a variety of potential causes of evil behavior, identifying key neurological structures and considering which environmental and behavioral factors might be important. It's a strong chapter and does provide some important context for consideration of evil from a psychological perspective. I only find myself wishing that substantially more of the book had been dedicated to that topic, so we could get an even deeper treatment. At the end of the day, I think true crime connoisseurs will find the book's hundreds, and I do mean hundreds, of case studies to be fascinating, and students of psychology will gravitate toward that final chapter. In that sense, the book has a little something for everyone, even if each audience might find itself wishing for more detailed coverage on whichever side they personally found most interesting. Next up, I returned to fiction. Not exactly horror fiction, although there is some overlap with the horror genre. And I need to preface this one by saying, don't judge me when you see what I read earlier last month. Give me a minute to explain myself before you rush to judgment. Because the book is this Midnight Investigation by Cheryl Lynn, and in case you can't tell from the cover art, this is, in fact, a Harlequin romance novel, which is emphatically not the kind of thing I normally like to read. The reason I picked this one up actually a while ago, and the reason I finally swallowed my pride and read it this month, is that I have a very bizarre personal connection to this one. As you know, if you've been around this channel for a while, I'm a member of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society. In fact, I've been co-writing that society's case files in my own books, along with the society's founder, Brian Bonner, who's my co-author. Well, several years back, Brian got his attention called to this romance novel about paranormal investigation. When he picked it up, he found that it centers on Rocky Mountain Paranormal's work, almost explicitly. Instead of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, it's now called, in the novel, the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Team. And instead of Brian, the founder's name has been changed to, of all things, Dallas Stone. But the author put words in the team members' dialogue in the novel that matches our own work so precisely, it would have been unthinkable that she, herself a Colorado resident, didn't borrow heavily from our own work. So Brian called up Harlequin's legal department to inquire, and apparently she denied ever having heard of us, which I personally don't believe for a minute. But these books have a shelf life of about a week anyway, so Brian decided, just as I would have, to just accept it as, I guess, what we would call a badge of weird. Just one of those weird things that happened along the way. Nothing really to be angry about, but just weird. Maybe they should have talked to us first, but who cares, right? It's funny. What's particularly funny is we've been telling that story, and I think our people, our readers, and people who listen to our podcast, people who watch this channel maybe now, have been intrigued enough that they've been buying copies of this book. You can get them pretty cheap on the secondary market. You can get them used. It's out of print. You have to get a used copy. And I like to imagine that there's some intern somewhere at the Harlequin offices wondering why all of a sudden this particular book is selling copies unexpectedly. It's probably not true, but this is my little fantasy that I like to have for myself. Anyway, that's why, even though this is not my genre, that's why I read this book. The plot here centers on a female member of Rocky Mountain Paranormal, not based on any of our real members, and she doesn't appreciate that she's been partnered with a psychic police officer. Of course, he turns out to actually be a psychic. She turns out to be being haunted by an evil entity. And by the time we're about halfway through the book, it goes full-on romance novel. Not my cup of tea at all, though I do have to admit, at least this one wasn't quite as filthy as people say these novels usually are. I wouldn't know, I don't read them. But it's also not really fair for me to review this novel in the way that I review other things. It's not my genre. And it's certainly not great literature, but this genre isn't trying to be fine art. It's trying to be just what it is. So it would be unreasonable to judge it by objective standards, because that's not what this genre is for. And it would be unfair for me to judge it by subjective standards, because it's not what I normally like to read. And though I don't know the genre well enough to say for certain, I do imagine this is the kind of thing that would appeal to readers of these romance novels. So I can't say good or bad. I think it's funny because of my personal connection, although the book itself is not to my taste. If you like these kinds of novels, though, it might be to your taste. So that's really all I can say. Next, I decided, again diverging from the horror genre, to read Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk. This is a sprawling 670-ish page biography that covers the entirety of Musk's life, beginning with a brief treatment of his ancestors' lives and his early childhood, and then primarily following the development of his various businesses through April of 2023, because the book was released a few months after that date, so that must have been the publication deadline. Obviously, there has been news since then, but that was the cutoff here. I read it for much the same reason I've read other biographies by the same author, and I've enjoyed some of his other biographies. I wanted to gain some insight into the mind of the kind of person who, with apologies to Lewis Carroll, seems to be able to accomplish 6 impossible things before breakfast. And Elon is certainly one of those kinds of people. And credit where it's due to the author. writing a biography of not only a living person, but one whose accomplishments keep adding up, and who isn't exactly known for holding back criticism when he feels he's been slighted, that can't be an easy challenge. For the most part, I think Isaacson did a good job of portraying Musk's life as objectively as possible, presenting the good along with the bad, and when sources have disagreed about what actually happened during some key events, that's rare, but during some key events, he presented both arguments. The one place he may have faltered a little bit in that regard is that after presenting the different arguments, he usually didn't shy away from offering his own interpretation, and one could argue about whether or not it's appropriate for a biographer to editorialize that way. For my money, I think he mostly stayed on the side of objective reporting and good taste, but probably couldn't help himself but to step ever so briefly over that line in just a couple, maybe two places. Praise is also due to the author for writing a biography that, like his other works, distills a lifetime of accomplishments into a readable and often entertaining narrative. However, at times this one does feel like the author is writing a biography as much of Musk's companies as the man himself, and several chapters do start to feel a little bit repetitive. It seems Musk often applies the same formula when solving either a business issue or an engineering challenge, and the book's strength and weakness, I think all at the same time, is that it lets the audience see how each of those situations unfolded. The repetition does help us understand Musk's operating procedure, but it also occasionally becomes, well, frankly, repetitive to read. Ultimately, I found it a highly enjoyable and useful, if imperfect and incomplete, biography. Probably the biggest downside to this book is that even in the give or take a year since its release, Musk's various adventures have already added at least another full biography's worth of content that, of course, necessarily is missing from this volume. So perhaps a few years down the road, either Isaacson or another biographer will again find the opportunity to give us a second volume. And that brings us back to a horror novel, or a novella anyway, with Coup de Grace by Sophia Ajram. Or Adram, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. This was one of the recent books I received in a Nightworms package. For those of you who've been watching my videos, and, well, you probably saw me open this one up. Anyway, this one is a short, clearly short, single-sitting sort of a novella that centers on a suicidal character who, on the way to finally end it all, finds himself trapped in what I suppose literary critic types would call a liminal space, consisting of a horrific abandoned, or at least seemingly abandoned, and inescapable subway station. That's a fascinating premise, and it does, I think, a pretty good job of using the brutalist structure of the subway station itself as a metaphor for the oppression of the main character's own mental illness. All well and good. And the characterization seems on point. Despite its short length, the novella does a pretty good job of capturing the self-destructive side of the main character's psychology. That's not to say the reader necessarily finds him to be a likable or relatable character. Personally, I did not. But he is an interesting character, and that's all a character really needs to be to make for a good story. Despite those strong elements, I struggled a bit to get invested early on, because the prose is simply too overwritten for my own personal taste. I don't mind some purple prose, and I honestly think the horror genre could use some more real poetic language. However, in this case, rather than really poetic, it came across as an author trying too hard to be poetic without ever quite succeeding. Coupled with metaphors and imagery that, while meaningful, are arguably too obvious and too on the nose to really be interesting or effective, That made for what I would have considered a decent but fairly mediocre read. Something I would enjoy well enough while reading its short length, but probably wouldn't remember as either outstanding or terrible for very long after I finished. And then we got to the ending, which I think actually will turn out to be rather memorable. I won't spoil the ending itself, but I think in order to provide a proper review, I do need to talk about how the format shifts at the end, because that's likely to divide audiences, and your thoughts about that issue will probably determine whether you find this book memorable in a good way or in a bad way. Specifically, at a key point in our main character's journey, the book suddenly, unexpectedly, with no forewarning and very little narrative explanation, directly addresses the reader and shifts into, I kid you not, a choose-your-own-adventure story. For me, that just ruined whatever success the novel had built up to that point. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I don't understand why the author chose that approach. Though I think it was, frankly, a terrible ending and a terrible idea, I do get where it came from. I just think it was a bit of a cheat to suddenly shift format that way. And whatever artistic goals the author was trying to achieve by doing so were more than undercut by the jarring experience of suddenly being told to turn to a different page for different outcomes. That format is associated with fun novelty books, and it doesn't seem to belong in what is otherwise trying, with varying degrees of success in different chapters, to be a serious work of psychological horror. Others will, of course, disagree with me, and if you're one of those people who thinks purple prose and experimental formats are more likely to help than to hinder, this might very well be a book for you. But I'm generally not one of those people, and I'm certainly not one of them with respect to this particular book, so I unfortunately can't in good conscience give it my recommendation. Next up, nothing in particular to do with horror, but nevertheless part of my monthly reading, was Al Swiegart's book, Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. I picked this one up along with a couple other Python books in my quest to start teaching myself some new skills. Not that I'm a complete beginner to Python, I've coded a bit before, though this book is suitable for such beginning readers, but my experience prior to this was pretty limited and I'm trying to expand my horizons, and this one seemed interesting. One of the nice things about this one in particular is that though it does start right from the beginning, that is, it tells you even how to download Python in the first place, it doesn't then spend too much time on the elementary. It gives you what you need to know, but then moves at an accelerated pace into more interesting projects and challenges. I think this sort of project-based approach to learning a programming language makes a lot of sense. We're all interested in learning these languages for some reason. We have some project in mind, or we have the idea, at least, of projects as an abstraction in mind. And this book gives us a taste of what the language is capable of, while also walking the reader through a variety of potentially useful projects. However, there's also a potential downside here, particularly if one is a complete beginner to Python. The book is arguably so accelerated that it leaves out some important details between those beginning baby steps and the more advanced, or let's say advanced beginner level projects it walks the reader through. Astute readers can probably pick up most of the information anyway, but if one is a complete beginner, it will likely be somewhat overwhelming in certain places. In particular, there are a couple of code examples that almost work but need slight modifications. Those could in fact be useful pedagogical tools if the reader is more intermediate, but could confuse and overwhelm those who are coding for the first time and don't know how to debug or find the resources they need to solve those kinds of problems. Despite those minor issues, though, I do recommend the book. To get the most out of it, I would suggest pairing it with some other resources. You may also want to plan on reading it through a couple different times. First, I'd say just read it straight through with minimal actual work at the keyboard, just to sort of get the lay of the land. Figure out where you're going, what the language does, how it all fits together. Get sort of a bird's eye view of it. Then, reread it, working through the guided examples step by step. And then perhaps read it even a third time while working through the practice challenges on your own without reference to the main text. If you do that, I think you'll be writing code in no time, particularly if you do pair it with some of those other types of other books or YouTube videos or whatever coding resources might be available and of use to you. And next up, also not a horror novel, although it does draw from a text that I would argue contains much of the best of the horror genre, and upon whose shoulders pretty much the entire horror genre rests, was Jordan Peterson's much anticipated new book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. And by the way, we who wrestle with God is actually what the word Israel actually means we who wrestle with God. So that's where the title comes from. Over the last several years, many people have tried to criticize Dr. Peterson for speaking about religious topics, frankly, at pretty great length, while also being somewhat opaque about his own religious views. When asked, for example, whether or not he believes in God, he often rejects the premise of the question rather than giving what most people would consider a forthright or straightforward answer. He has explained his reasoning there, and I understand where he's coming from and why he answers as he does, and I don't even disagree with him. But I also understand why some people consider his responses unsatisfactory. I read this book in part hoping for a more nuanced and complete exploration of Peterson's own, let us say, wrestling with religious faith and religious ideas. The book largely isn't that, actually. It does contain some of those elements, and it will certainly give the reader a good sense of the character of Peterson's thought on matters of religion. But the text is focused largely on the same kinds of scriptural interpretation through the lens of psychology, for which Dr. Peterson has become well known. Indeed, though this book arguably goes deeper than his prior work has, readers who have followed Peterson's prior biblical commentaries, particularly his lecture series on Genesis and his multi-part seminar on Exodus, will find that much of this book, however fascinating and however well written, is largely familiar. That's because the bulk of this book doesn't focus on wrestling with God in a more personal or abstract sense, but rather through the lens of the biblical narratives themselves, again through Peterson's psychological interpretation, beginning right at the start with Genesis 1, and continuing through the tale of Jonah, but leaving out a lot of the stuff in between. It certainly has an Old Testament focus, although Peterson remarks regularly on the parallels between the tales upon which he's focused and various observations about the Gospels that he thinks fit well together. In terms of the quality of information presented, long-term readers or listeners of Peterson's will not be disappointed. He takes great care to draw from a variety of disciplines when making his commentary, though the final product still maintains his trademark emphasis on psychological, and particularly, although certainly not exclusively, Jungian analysis. In the past, some critics, including Richard Dawkins, the biologist, have accused Peterson of being drunk on symbols, and I suspect the same criticism would probably apply here. While I find more value in symbolic interpretation than does somebody like Professor Dawkins, even I remarked on a couple of points while reading the book that Peterson might have been taking his symbolic thinking a step too far. Nevertheless, the scholarship is of high quality and offers the reader much to think about, even in those moments when we might not agree with Dr. Peterson's conclusions. Readers who have only read Peterson's more popular 12 Rules for Life books may be somewhat surprised to find this is a substantially denser work that requires a lot more intellectual interaction on the part of the reader. It's written in accessible language and certainly isn't meant for only an academic audience, but at the same time, it's clearly meant for readers willing to do the work of pausing between chapters, or maybe even sometimes between individual paragraphs, to deeply reflect upon what has been written. In that sense, I'd place it between Peterson's popular, what would you say, self-help style books and his extremely dense and academic maps of meaning, in terms both of reading difficulty and philosophical depth. All in all, I'm not sure if it's Peterson's absolute best work to date, but it is yet another thought-provoking read well worth one's attention. And finally, I did in fact finish out the month with a return to our favorite genre. Not with a horror novel in this case, but a collection of short stories by Stephen Graham Jones called After the People Lights Have Gone Off. Stephen Graham Jones is one of the more popular horror authors these days, and deservedly so. But my experience with his work has just been his novels, so I was pretty excited to dive into these short stories and see how he is in the shorter form. And overall, I'll tell you right from the start, I'm pretty happy, although I do think he's better in the longer format. The stories themselves are pretty solid. One or two stood out as particularly great, and one or two didn't really do much for me, but most of these are solid, middle-of-the-road kinds of horror stories. They're good, but they don't necessarily pack the biggest punch. But on the other hand, they do present some nice original twists on a genre that too often becomes rather stale. So I would call most of them good, not great, a couple great, and a couple just didn't work for me. Where I think this collection is most likely to divide readers is in terms of Jones's writing style. He has a unique, almost poetic quality to his prose that some might consider elevated and others might consider overwritten. For myself, I generally like it, but I think this is perhaps why I think his writing appeals more to me in novels than in short stories. In a longer work, the reader has more time to get immersed in the story to the point that the style becomes invisible in a way it never quite does in the short form. Similarly, novels allow more space for the author to distinguish characters' voices from his own. So I sometimes found myself quite conscious that I was reading a story rather than truly getting immersed in the story, even if the story itself was great. The collection also does include a set of story notes at the end, which I always like. I like to get a sort of peek behind the curtain at what the author was thinking, although I will say these particular notes don't really tell us much about the genesis of the stories, other than which editors requested which tales and sort of the business side of where the stories came from, much more than the real creative side of it. But that's neither here nor there. I'm not criticizing a book because of its story notes. We're going to really focus on the stories themselves. And bottom line there, it's a good collection, but probably not as good as its hype, and certainly not quite as good as some of the same author's other works. And that brings us to the end of another month in my reading room. I think I did better this month than I've done in a couple recent months, though I am still doing a bit of catching up. Of course, it is December now as I'm filming this. I was talking about November, but it's December now. And I am already well underway with my end-of-year reading, so only time will tell whether or not I will actually be able to hit my reading goal for the year. I'm a little bit behind, but I'm doing my best. So do be sure to stick around to find out, which means, of course, subscribe and ring that notifications bell. Don't forget, you can find purchase links for all of these books down in the What's It. And most importantly of all, until next time, take care and stay scared.